Our next speaker is Dr. Anthony Perl. He's Director of Urban Studies for the Simon Fraser University. He is excuse me. He's Professor of Urban Studies and Political Science and he's received undergraduate honors degree in government from Harvard University, followed by an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. His research crosses disciplinary and national boundaries to explore policy decisions made about transportation, cities, and the environment. He has published in dozens of scholarly journals, including Energy Policy, Transportation Research Journal of Transport Geography, and a myriad of others. His work has been awarded and recognized internationally. He's also published 5 books, including The Politics of Improved Urban Air Quality, which he co-edited and co-authored, and New Departures, Rethinking Passenger Rail Policy in the 21st Century. So with that, please welcome Anthony Perl.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me down to San Jose. It's a pleasure to be here, especially in this room where lots of good karma happened with Rod Diridan and his leadership over the years. And I hope to see more of it with the High-Speed Rail Association. So I'm going to talk about China today. There's an old proverb that the Chinese have, those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. So how does one get around that? The answer is teamwork. I can speak about this, and fortunately, I was able to create a team with some Chinese colleagues who know, but might get into trouble if they spoke. I'm pretty sure that at least one of those names at the bottom is an alias, and therefore we were able to get, because I haven't met that individual, but I did meet Professor Wu and Mr. Sun, and we were able to get some data on the effects and the development of high-speed rail in China, which I think will be quite valuable for you to consider. China is what the U.S. could have done 10 years ago, or give or take. I wrote a book at that time called Transport Revolutions, which laid out a blueprint for moving people and freight without oil. And basically, China followed it, and the U.S. could still. Let's put it positively. China is a place where the impacts of mobility and urbanization are moving on a fast-forward speed. As you heard, over 20,000 kilometers by now of high-speed rail. They have the world record in terms of the speed of building high speed. No one's going to surpass that, I think, 19,000 kilometers in 9 years. And just to give you a sense of their urban development skills, they built a 57-story tower building in 19 days. You can look at the videos on the internet. It was all modular. I don't think they do that as a normal course of action, but they wanted to show that they could. And literally, both the transportation and the urban impacts of it are unfolding very quickly, and we have a lot to learn from that. So in the room is Andy Getz, and several years ago, he and I collaborated on looking at the Chinese national high-speed rail network, and they built so much of it that we can now see at least 3 different configurations, operating models of high-speed rail. There's probably more than that, but the 3 that are worth thinking about are highlighted in the red zones that we'll be zooming in on in the presentation. The first one is the original Shinkansen-style corridor mode. You know, that's where we've got the word corridor from, really, was the high-speed rail ability to link megacities, and the original ones were Tokyo and Osaka, quickly, getting it in that under 3-hour time travel, and that reshaped mobility in that corridor. Then we have what maybe it's a mouthful, monocentric radial mode of high-speed rail. That's what the French pioneered with the TGV. A super hub at Paris and connecting out, as you saw previously, to the rest of the country, and then eventually international networks as well. And finally, the Chinese have added a new, so they've developed both of those following in the footsteps of earlier innovators. And now they're developing a new configuration, which again is a mouthful, a multi-core network mode. It's the latest and maybe the greatest high-speed rail configuration. It will connect the super cities of the 21st century, by which I mean these are places where you can get from one part to the other within an hour's travel time. Not 3 hours, but 1 hour, which means daily commuting is possible. That's what makes a super city. China has 2 of these currently, and maybe they'll have more. Jing-Jin-Ji, if you'll excuse my stumbling over it, is the Beijing super city region centered around the capital. It's got 130 million people in a space that's basically the UK without Northern Ireland and part of Scotland. All of that is connected within 1 hour. That's the largest configuration of people, 130 million people in an hour's travel time from one another. So while European and Japanese high-speed rail offer many lessons for mobility, I think China can teach us some new things about urban development impacts of high-speed rail. And I think that they're not totally unrelated to North America possibilities. Here are 4 configurations, corridors that are currently functioning on the left in China with their length in English measure for this audience, and some comparable US markets. So we're going to look at these now. The Harbin-Dalian corridor, 568 miles long, a little bit longer than the LA-San Francisco high-speed rail line that we're in the heart of here. Then there's the Yangtze Delta network, very similar to the Northeast region. If you took everything that Amtrak runs from Maine down to Virginia, maybe Richmond area. The super city of Jing-Jin-Ji, similar length to the California corridors that currently exist. If you took the Surfliner, the San Joaquin, and the Capital Corridor, those are similar spaces. And finally, the Greater Wuhan hub, which is very similar to the Midwest hubs that converge around Chicago. So let's look at these urban impacts. We're going to talk more about that than the mobility part. First, we'll begin, since we're in California and thinking a lot about the high-speed rail corridor here, we'll begin with Harbin to Dalian, 2 cities that I've not been to, that aren't top of mind in the United States, but there's some good experience to learn. So we did accessibility modeling. Basically, this map shows you the Harbin-Dalian corridor. What it also shows in gradations is how accessible each station is along that line. And accessibility measurements basically take the sum of the places you can get to and divide it by the travel time along the line. And if you notice, the interesting fact is that every station along the line has a lot of accessibility. There's another place you probably never heard of called Shenyang in the middle. That's where the accessibility is the highest, because that's where the line branches off in different directions, and they have the most connectivity. And so it's not the end cities, the way Tokyo and Osaka are for their corridor. It's the middle that gets the greatest accessibility, and we'll see some interesting effects from that in a moment. Here are population growth before and after high-speed rail. As I said, high-speed rail has moved so quickly in China that you can see recent effects. Before high-speed rail, between the 5 years between 2005 and 2010, you can notice population growth is bigger at the ends of the corridor. Harbin, Dalian, those orange colors, that's faster growing than the middle of the corridor. You put high-speed rail in around 2010, 2009, all of a sudden it changes. The ends don't quite grow as fast as they did before. There's still growth going on. But notice around Shenyang, all of a sudden, there's much more population growth there. So the greater accessibility that's created on the corridor enables growth in intermediate cities to surpass the endpoints, which was not happening before you put this infrastructure in. And again, as I've said, this is the specs, if you will, for the corridor they've built. It's about 3.5 hour end-to-end travel time. Some of it's not entirely brand new infrastructure. Some parts are shared track. And the population at either end is smaller than both the Bay Area and the Los Angeles basin. So the question that raises, I think, is whether there's lessons or parallels with what could happen here in California. You know the length, the trips, and there's also some shared tracks along the way, which we heard about the electrification yesterday, up from here to the Salesforce Tower. What would the effects be? Well, again, we've heard this yesterday. A lot of people think that the Central Valley will benefit the most from this because of the accessibility gain. And what I'm suggesting to you is, people say, oh, that's speculation. Well, it's not. You have actual data and evidence now from China that shows that's exactly what will happen. And my conjecture is that San Jose would be the Shenyang of this corridor, because that's where the lines split. That's where you get the most accessibility as a result of this. So, but as was said before, also the growth in population will happen at points intermediate along the corridor. So there's a lesson there if people want to be skeptical and say, oh, this is just a conjecture, or it's a risk, or not a likely outcome. I think that China shows that it can work that way. Now, let's move to another configuration of high-speed rail and what it's done in China. We'll talk about a hub-and-spoke model, the monocentric radial mode. And we'll go to a place, again, that is probably not that familiar to people in this room, including me. I've never been there. Wuhan. Wuhan is the Chicago of China. It has 648 route miles of high-speed rail that all converge. And this is the Chicago Union Station of China, Wuhan, its high-speed rail hub. Over 70 million people are connected to it, a regional economy of about $500 billion. What are the effects of putting high-speed rail in and getting them all to converge in this lovely space in Wuhan? Well, here's the accessibility map again, figuring out the travel time and the number of places you can get to. And as you can see, it's concentrated. Wuhan, the hub, has the most accessibility. But the effects are interesting to see what that leads to. This is average GDP growth before high-speed rail in the region. And if you notice, there's not as much at the hub, but certain areas at the periphery have fairly high GDP growth along the way, and others have low GDP growth. It's uneven, in other words. The region before high-speed rail, there were lots of different factors and forces going on, and you see a lot of different colors before this is put in place. But after 2010, notice the color gets much more evenly distributed across the economic picture for the region. So what does that tell us that might be relevant for Rick's work in the Midwest? I think that a Chicago high-speed hub, the Wuhan of the U.S., could distribute economic growth a lot more evenly around the Midwest, where you also see these days a lot of variation. I mean, Chicago's thriving, it's doing great. I guess I don't want to claim expertise in economic geography of the Midwest, but I think there's quite a range and variation between, St. Louis and Milwaukee and maybe Detroit along the way. High-speed rail might really sort of spread the success around the Midwest. And again, if you want evidence of that, go to Wuhan. So that's a lesson that I would take from China. Now let's move to this brand new frontier that China is figuring out, the multi-core supercity, the multi-core radial network. There's two of them to look at briefly. One is the capital-focused one, the Jing-Jin-Ji supercity. It's a work in progress. Right now, you see the lines, the high-speed rail lines with cutting around. Beijing is at the top. It's sort of a wishbone-shaped, doesn't completely connect up yet. And of course, Beijing has the highest accessibility. along the way. But people are, just as was mentioned in France, spreading out from Beijing and commuting in when you have 1 hour travel time. All of these places along the dark lines, the high-speed, are within 1 hour of Beijing. So all of a sudden, you've got commuter suburbs, if you want to call them that, but they look a lot different than the streetcar suburbs of the United States. Here's a picture from one of them along the way. You've got 30-story towers right next to each other before they've even paved the roads in the community. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be catching up to do this. You can build high-speed rail fast, you can build apartments fast. Apparently it takes longer to put the roads in. There are people walking to the high-speed train from their apartments in these bedroom communities. And so that's got to be fixed. And then you've also got the problem of connectivity. I was talking to Andy last night, and he said he almost missed a train in Beijing because it's so hard to get to the high-speed rail stations. So intermodal integration is going to be a key to making this work. If you have tens of millions of people commuting, maybe even more than, many tens of millions of people commuting by high-speed rail in these super cities, they're going to need to have very good high-capacity options at their stations, especially in Beijing, the main destination, to distribute and get where they're going. And that's also a work in progress. So the future of that depends on some other pieces of infrastructure that are still to be done. It's a little bit better developed down in the Yangtze Delta, which is the area around Shanghai. That network has been built out more, and we can see some effects from that. So that's the conventional, that's before high-speed rail, conventional accessibility with Shanghai off in the middle on the right, and Nanjing up at the top. These were places that were not 1 hour from each other before high-speed rail, but they are now. So this is what it looks like now since high-speed rail, and you can see that they've done a loop. They've got more places, both inland and coastal, connected up with each other within an hour. And of course, Shanghai is the densest and highest levels of accessibility, but there's some interesting connectivity and options in other places. Let's see what the effects of that have been. Since 2004, these are maps based on travel surveys of people who are doing regular, like more than twice a week commuting in the region. And you can see that some of them are going even beyond the 1 hour time zone. But that's now the commuting patterns that have been established in volume. The thicker the lines, the more people are using them in the super city of the Yangtze Delta. The growth rates are highest in the region since high-speed rail at the periphery. So in the northwest of the super city, where the land was cheap and was not as accessible, cheaper I should say, where there's long-distance commuting, that's been the fastest growth in the area. Industrial growth, that's just general economic growth. Now, if you move to just industry, you can see it's moving out from the coast, moving away from Shanghai, moving inland, manufacturing. And again, the parts that are inland and connected with the high-speed rail lines have some of the fastest growth in the region. So when it comes to what would it look like in this part of the U.S. or this part of North America, it raises the question whether California, with the high-speed line that's under construction, and the often discussed Las Vegas, Southern Nevada high-speed link that could connect into it, does that begin to sort of create a network option that looks a little bit like these multi-core networks in China? If you put the people and the economics together, it looks similar. The total population, this was maybe it's gone up to a little more since I did this last year, over 37 million people. Regional economic activity, if you add California and Southern Nevada together, it's pretty impressive, almost $2 trillion. The question I think that needs to be asked is, when you're thinking of all these different links and when you build things and how you dig tunnels to connect them properly, what segments could be connected in this part of the world within an hour? And the ones that are would start behaving, in my view, like these Chinese super cities that are out there. So that leaves us with lots of possibilities to think about, and hopefully to convince people that high-speed rail has a huge urban development and economic growth potential to make not just mobility better in the United States, but also economic and social opportunities. I think that we're into new territory in China in these super cities. They're going to be the largest sort of experience in human history yet where people are so connected up with each other. The current largest metropolitan area is the Tokyo metropolitan area, where you go, how many people can get to and from each other in an hour. That's Metro Tokyo. This will be 3 times the size of that. And it'll be 4 times the size of the Benelux region, Brussels, Amsterdam, Luxembourg, that area. I think we're going to see some new outcomes from that. And I don't pretend to know exactly what they are, but I think there'll be new economic and social results from that. And I think that the more we can learn about it, the more opportunity there will be for us to, I guess, have some advantage. Maybe it's a small consolation, but at least having some advantage of our backwardness in high-speed rail development, that we will be able to benefit from the opportunities that have been shown by some of the leaders in this. And as I said, I think that there are at least the equivalent value of a Google or an Apple out there in the kinds of urban redevelopment that could be created by these different patterns of high-speed rail. And the more people know what's worked and how it's worked in the places that are doing it, the more opportunity there will be to create value when we do it in this part of the world. Thank you very much.